In our last lesson, we talked at great length how the newly independent nation called India sought to bring about changes and reforms in its economic condition by implementing a mixed economic model. Now that was with regard to the domestic sphere of the country. Now no country can exist in isolation, because whenever any country or any kingdom exists somewhere, it will have certain neighboring powers. And there now needs to be a proper policy which would state the relationship that particular country would have with its neighboring powers. Now how is this done? This is done through implementing proper foreign policies. Now foreign policy states the relationship that a country will have with other foreign powers. It also states the trade activities that would take place between this country and the foreign countries. It also states how that country will be conducting itself with regard to its neighboring nations, and these are determined by certain domestic considerations as well as responses from those foreign powers. Now when India came into being as an independent nation, the policymakers had to take care of India's foreign policy as well, because India had to have a proper relationship with the several countries of the world. It needed to define its position in foreign politics. In this lesson, we will be focusing on the search for an independent foreign policy that began in India subsequent to the country's attaining its independence. India from the beginning followed a policy of non-alignment. Now what do we understand by this idea of non-alignment? In order to properly understand the foundation of this idea of non-alignment, we have to take our discussion a little further. And we will be doing so in a little while, but for now let us understand that India adopted a policy of non-alignment. After India attained its independence, it now chose to follow a middle ground. It did not want to meddle with the political affairs of other countries. Instead, it wanted to maintain its own sovereignty and have healthy and conducive relationships with all the other foreign powers. And India's foreign policy of non-alignment was given the leadership by the then Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. In fact, Jawaharlal Nehru can also be considered an architect of this idea of non-alignment. India soon rose to be a leader of all such African and Asian nations who also chose to follow this policy of non-alignment. But having been introduced to this policy of non-alignment, let us now learn about the reasons why this policy of non-alignment was adopted by India. Following the Second World War, the world was now broken into two factions. There emerged two very powerful political powers, and these were the USA on the one hand and the USSR on the other. So the world was broken into two halves, so to speak. The USA was a capitalist state. What do we understand by capitalism? Capitalism thrives on private ownership. So private enterprises are given support in the USA. Contrary to that, the erstwhile USSR was a communist state. Now communism is a left-wing ideology that seeks to abolish private enterprises in the favor of public ownership of the modes of production like labor, resources, capital. And so the USA and the USSR were split in terms of their ideological differences. And because of this tension between the USA and the USSR ensued the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of utmost political tension and hostility between these two warring factions, and they had broken the world into two halves. USA and its allies came to be known as the First World, and the First World was in support of capitalism, and USSR and its allies were called the Second World, and they were in support of communism, as you can see here. Over the years, these two warring nations were at each other's neck. Now, when India gained independence, India knew that it had to dissociate itself from this world politics. It had to take a very diplomatic stance so as to not be in favor of any of these power blocks, and at the same time not to make itself completely invisible in world politics. So the world at this point of time was broken into three worlds, so to speak. USA and its allies, as we just mentioned, constituted the First World. And then there was the Second World that comprised the USSR and its allies. And the rest of the world was called the Third World. Now, these Third World countries were mostly the developing nations, because most of these Third World countries used to be the colonies of the British as well as other European colonial powers. And so during this period of decolonization that was happening together with the Cold War, these Third World countries were gaining their independence from colonial rule. And so these Third World countries at this point of time were very fragile. It was difficult for them to navigate this world politics. So there was utmost hostility between the First World and the Second World, and it was incumbent on the Third World countries to take a diplomatic political stance. And India did likewise. This is because India followed a policy of non-alignment. Now, the Third World countries were already having it quite difficult. This is because they were having to navigate world politics as well as take care of their domestic concerns. Immediately after attaining independence, these Third World countries were rife with political tensions, with economic crisis. So these things needed to be taken care of by the Third World countries. And so the Third World countries felt that it was better to maintain distance from both the superpowers, which were the USA and the USSR. But they also wanted to make a statement to make their presence felt in world politics, so that they did not seem isolationist or anti-internationalist. Now try to understand this. This is a difficult concept. These Third World countries wanted to follow a policy of non-involvement. They did not want to align with either the First World or the Second World, because they knew that by aligning with either the First World or the Second World, they would run the risk of any kind of invasion from the other hostile bloc. And so they tried to dissociate themselves, distance themselves from those two warring blocs. At the same time, they did not want to make their status invisible in world politics. They did not want to show that they were isolationists. They were not isolationists. They were very much a part of world politics, but they simply did not want to interfere in the Cold War and the politics that were happening at that point of time. They also did not want to show themselves as anti-internationalist. That is to say, they did not want to posit that they were against international politics. So they had to follow, so they had to look for a middle ground to attain this kind of a non-involvement. So this idea of non-involvement from the politics of the Cold War took the shape of a policy that was known as the non-aligned movement. Now, this non-aligned movement was the perfect means for nations who did not wish to be involved in the Cold War blocs, but they wanted to be responsible for own sovereignty. So these third world countries were independent sovereign nations and they wanted to remain so. They did not want to side with either the USA or the USSR in the Cold War. To this end, in the year 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru now convened the Asian Relations Conference that was held in New Delhi. And here, delegates from all the corners of Asia attended the conference. And even those Asian regions that were not independent had also sent their delegates to the Asian Relations Conference of 1947. And this was convened by Jawaharlal Nehru. Now we have been talking about this from the beginning of this lesson that Jawaharlal Nehru played a very important role in shaping this idea of non-alignment. Now the main purpose of the Asian Relations Conference of 1947 was to show the world the unity that could exist in Asia. Because till this point of time, the European powers or even the USA did not take into consideration most of the Asian nations. In fact, most of these Asian nations were the erstwhile colonies. But now these Asian nations, independent as they were, they wanted to show that they could stand united. And they also wanted to demand independence from the impositions of the imperialist powers. So the imperialist powers were the First World and the Second World. Both the USA and the USSR were wanting to exert and increase their influence over more and more regions so that they became more powerful. But in the Asian Relations Conference of 1947, these Asian nations stated that they wanted to remain free from the impositions of these imperialist powers. The Asian Relations Conference of 1947 was a huge success. And so this was followed by the Bandung Conference of 1955. Now the Bandung Conference of 1955 was not just attended only by Asian nations. Instead, delegates from African nations also came to attend the Bandung Conference of 1955. The Bandung Conference was held in April 1955 at a place called Bandung in Indonesia. And this was hosted by the Indonesian President Ahmed Sukarno. This conference was attended by 29 Asian and African countries. So just a while ago we mentioned that the Asian Relations Conference of 1947 was a huge success. And so the Bandung Conference was then held in 1955 where both Asian and African nations joined. And these African and Asian nations all wanted to follow a policy of non-alignment, a policy of non-involvement in the Cold War blocs. And these 29 Asian and African countries together represented 54% of the entire world population. So this was now a new force to be reckoned with because they constituted more than half of the world population. Following the success of the Asian Relations Conference and the Bandung Conference of 1955, now the non-aligned movement was founded and it held its first summit at Belgrade in 1961. So here on this map you can locate the European country called Serbia, and it is in a place called Belgrade where the first summit of the non-aligned movement was held in 1961. Before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. Where was the first summit of the non-aligned movement held? Was it held in New Delhi, Bandung, Belgrade or Jakarta? Well, the correct answer is Belgrade. It is in Belgrade that the first summit of the non-aligned movement was held in 1961. This Belgrade summit of the non-aligned movement was attended by 28 nations from Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe and Latin America. So the politicians of these countries from Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe and Latin America wanted to follow a policy of non-alignment, which, mind you, was shaped by Jawaharlal Nehru. And so these nations joined the first summit of the NAM, which was held at Belgrade in 1961. The persons we see here on the screen are the architects of NAM, or the founding fathers of NAM, so to speak. So we begin with Jawaharlal Nehru. Jawaharlal Nehru was the first Prime Minister of India, and Jawaharlal Nehru was inspired by socialist ideas that he was exposed to when he went to the USSR. And Jawaharlal Nehru was also an architect of not just NAM but this entire policy of non-alignment, because it was under his leadership that India adopted this policy of non-alignment, of non-involvement in the Cold War politics. After this, we have Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt. Now, Nasser was an Egyptian politician who played a very crucial role in overthrowing monarchical rule in Egypt, and subsequently he went on to becoming the president of Egypt. After that, we have Kwame Nkrumah, who was the president of Ghana. Nkrumah had played a very important role in abolishing British colonial rule from the Gold Coast. And so, after this Gold Coast got its independence, Nkrumah became the president of Ghana. Then we have Josip Broz Tito, and Tito was the president of Yugoslavia. Tito was a Yugoslavian politician who founded the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia, and he later on became the president of Yugoslavia. And then last but not the least, we have Ahmed Sukarno, who was the president of Indonesia. Ahmed Sukarno led the Indonesian independence struggle, and after Indonesia got its independence, Sukarno became the president of Indonesia. So we can see how all these men in power from various countries like India, Egypt, Ghana, Yugoslavia and Indonesia had together joined hands to be the architects of NAM. Jawaharlal Nehru has left behind a great legacy, be that in the form of the economic policies that were implemented during his rule, or the non-alignment movement that he had shaped. In fact, the policy of non-alignment and the pledge to the non-aligned movement still continue to dominate and play an integral part of Indian foreign policy till date. So till date, India follows a policy of non-alignment. It does not meddle with the warring nations of the globe. The NAM has continued to exert its influence in the global scenario, because initially it was just an organization or an association of the third world countries. But later on it ceased to remain so, because the NAM has now 120 members from Africa, Asia, Latin America as well as the Middle East. And there are also 17 observer nations. So there are many observer countries, member countries who together make up the NAM. This now brings us to an end of our discussion on the foreign policy that India followed and still continues to follow after the country got its independence from colonial rule in 1947. We learned how India in its early stages was not at all willing to meddle with the Cold War politics, and so India did not want to side with either the USA or the USSR. It wanted to follow a policy of non-involvement, of dissociation from these Cold War blocs. And so now was shaped the idea of non-alignment by the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. We learnt about various conferences and summits that were organized and held before the first summit of the NAM that was held at Belgrade in 1961. Initially, the NAM began as an association of the third world countries, but now it has many members from different parts of the world. So with this, we conclude our discussion on the independent foreign policy that India adopted after attaining its independence. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.